morning. Good
morning.
Always reminded of the training I missed out in my undergraduate work in education because I was secondary training, not elementary. I just had no skills in gathering people back then. Unless you're at lunch duty, you had to scream your head off. That people hear you. So anyway, good morning. Hey, as you're continuing to partake in some of the fruit and rolls and coffee and juice, I like a really good activity, as many of you practice, I'm sure, being able to kind of refocus and recenter where we left off yesterday and kind of beginning a new day is to think about what stood out for you from yesterday's many discussions, many activities, but certainly there are things that kind of surface. So if you would take just a moment to think about that, what stood out for you from yesterday's discussion. Certainly there's a lot of prompts on the wall for you to draw your memory from some of our work, but what was maybe most meaningful for you? And when you're ready, would you turn to the person next to you and share? I'll give you about 90 seconds to do that, and then I'll call you back. All right? Thanks.
I can't. You know, and even before went to bed and he was kind of like, I don't do any other things, right? Figure it out and
Thanks, everyone.
Like, I don't want to go into it and just talk about it.
So, you thought, you prepared. Anyone be willing to share out loud what you or your partner shared stood
call it an epiphany, but we came to the same conclusion on yesterday when we were talking about how to get into an abusive relationship, the steps that you go through. I had said, if somebody came up to you and said, well, do you want to go on a date? I'm going to abuse you. I'm going to do this and that. And how hard it is to come back from that. That was just kind of a moment, like, because we've all been in situations where you're like, she's not very smart, or I don't know how you got in that situation. And then in the end, seeing it from that perspective was a whole lot different. I think it made us both kind of re-examine the thought process. And it wasn't anything that we didn't know. You know it takes a long time to get to that point. But to have it brought to you like that, I'm like,
Thank you.
We talk about the process of unlearning in the beginning, right? And so when we talk about abuse and sort of these situations, it obviously jumps to that physical abuse like we're talking about. But as you see listed here, there's so many different forms. And do I think of those things? Do I ask about those things when I'm concerned about a friend or a colleague or a student? And really not just the real big obvious ones that are easily called attention to, but those smaller ones that are just as damaging and harmful. Just being more mindful of those when I bring up examples, right? Like if I'm talking about an example with an RA or something in a training session, I would use one of those bigger examples, not one of those smaller examples that they maybe see and aren't equating to being on the same level as one of the more extreme examples that we typically tend to use in these scenarios.
Yeah, thank you. That impressed me, was impressed upon me early on with this model that the scenario really tried to get all of our conversations should navigate around this, the verbal and emotional stuff, and that's where we can profound impact. So I've always been impressed with that part of it. Thank you. Yes. Thank you. We have a full agenda, and go to the next slide. Here's we'll regroup today around the box activity, and then get into really help kind of set the stage for the facilitation and prep and practice that will take place for the rest of the day. We'll work this morning prior to lunch. We have 3 of the 6 rotations that we will convene, and we'll be together for the first activity, and then we'll separate into 2 equal groups, one here, one next door, and option C. And we'll break for lunch probably around the same time, 11:30 noonish, for lunch. Come back, finish up the facilitations, have some conversation about those facilitations, some feedback both from the presenters and both from as well as those who are participating in that activity. Come back for a larger group debrief, and that will bring us pretty close to 4 o'clock. After we do some wrap up and talk about some final parking lot was behind there. Some final loose ends, but just know that in our conversations with Becca and Tess and Michael and Carol yesterday, that some of our loose ends will be opportunities for us to reconvene via phone conference, Zoom conference during your monthly meetings,
consortium meetings.
So our loose ends are actually will be extensions of this conversation as we work together, as you work towards scheduling and organizing. I know there's already scheduled, but organizing and putting some of the final touches on some of your trainings coming up here this late summer or fall, and then moving forward together. so forward to all of that. So just know that we are thinking ahead and planning for some touch points along the way in this conversation. So welcome back this morning. Well, look forward to the day here. So Daryl, good morning. Thank you for coming back.
Thank you for fulfilling your contract.
The plane was taking off, right?
Welcome back, Daryl. Thanks.
Thanks, Al. So, yeah, good stuff. There, hopefully, we'll get a chance to, at some point later on in the day, take a look at some of the media around, that we brought together from different aspects of it, and again, hopefully we get a chance to talk about this a little bit more, but as you were sort of describing some of the takeaway from yesterday, particularly around just sort of taking in the sort of dynamics of the way that these issues often play out between people and relationships and within organizations, et cetera. There's some really interesting ways in which to sort of bring that to light and sort of surface some of this stuff in a way that can generate some really good conversation using media around it as well. So hopefully we get a chance to at least preview a little bit of that, and perhaps that becomes part of, again, some of the, you call them loose ends, that would just kind of sort of continued development, right? As we began yesterday, the invitation is there to continue to feel like there's more of this that I can take in, continue to develop the skills that I already have, right? Develop new sort of fruitful tributaries to my own already sort of rich sea. Do seas have tributaries? Do seas have tributaries, or is that just rivers? To my deep river of knowledge. In any event, so we're actually going to start today. We left off yesterday. Is this the exact number?
I didn't make the copies, so I don't know.
Sharing is caring. Don't take two.
If we need to make more copies, I can run.
Keep handing them around if you.
Only these two.
No, we're still going.
Oh.
Does everyone have a copy?
Do you need more? Oh, thank you.
Are we?
I think we're good.
It's exact.
You want me to make more?
No, we're good. I think I.
Well, now I have two. I feel like, is somebody sharing that needs a copy? It's okay. Nope, I have two now.
You do.
So I was holding them up going, I have two.
All right. So, we're gonna get into this discussion around the scenario. It's in some respects paired, as we often do, the agree, disagree we ended the day with yesterday in terms of circumstance. So obviously this is a part of the session where we walk through this as a way of modeling facilitation. So I'm gonna ask somebody to please read the scenario out loud for us.
You get it. It's an open secret in your work environment that a popular and charismatic member of your staff has used subtle sexist and racist comments with a number of older students. Although the students are adults, this appears to fit a pattern of possibly discriminatory language and behavior. At first, you looked away from this situation, but you've heard that several of the students, many of whom fit the profile of naive, inexperienced, and vulnerable, have felt emotionally devastated and confused. You know that your institution discourages faculty and administrators from engaging in this type of conduct with students, but you don't have any direct supervisory responsibilities with the person involved.
Okay, thank you very much. Can somebody else please read the training clause?
This is a difficult situation. I don't want to be the self-appointed morals police, but this person might be causing real harm to these students and to our institution. This is not a live and let live kind of matter. It could be a clear abuse of power, and if I don't say or do something, I might be complicit in ongoing abuses. But who am I to insert myself into this tricky situation? What if I'm misjudging the whole thing? Then again, while I might not be this person's supervisor, I am their colleague. If I remain silent, aren't I part of the problem? I do have to consider that it could get ugly. This person is popular and has lots of friends. They could retaliate against me in some way. I've already got enough to worry about. Should I really get involved with this? What should I do?
All right, thank you. Okay. The first question, is this realistic scenario? Is this something that can or does happen? Yeah, has anyone been in, you don't have to name any names, but been in a situation similar to this? That you'd be willing to share what was happening, what were the dynamics, how did it play out?
For me, it was a little different because I'm the Title IX coordinator. So it was a faculty member who likes to view themselves as very popular, but was making very inappropriate statements in his office. And so the conversation was had that because there was a few statements said, but we didn't know the real meat of it, and because the door would go close. So they didn't look good and so there was a discussion of appearances and his power, and you're not here to be their friend, you're here to instruct. And so.
Well, when you say they were discussed, so take us from, it doesn't look good, people have concerns, to having the conversation. So it brings that, like, who
Okay,
began
there
that
was
process?
like office people around that noticed it, like he would make sexual comments to students, ask them about their love life, their sex life, are they happy, those type things, and yeah. And so the faculty had reported him, but then once those questions were asked, the door was closed, so we didn't know if the conversation stopped there or continued, or was he having a more personal and appropriate conversation with them. So then it was reported to me as to what to do, and so with the deans, there was a conversation as to this is how this looks, it's inappropriate, you know, it is not your, you know, you're not to ask those kind of questions.
In your role as a Title IX person. Okay, gotcha, thank you. Anything else?
I have a situation where I counsel survivors of sexual assault, and so I had a student who was on one of the athletic teams tell me about the situation where she told the coach about what had happened, and it was somebody on the alleged perpetrator was a male student on the male version of her sport team, so they were always together. And she informed me of the conversation that the coach had with her. Similar to, like, not necessarily boys will be boys, but along those lines, and said some really inappropriate things. And in my position as confidential advisor on that campus, I had to take it to the Title IX coordinator and be like, what's being said, I'm being told this. I was then told, then it's kind of out of my hands, and so I was then told that there was a conversation had with this coach. I don't know if there was, because some of those comments actually are still happening, or at least I'm hearing that they're still happening, so. It's sort of a bigger cultural thing that I'm in the process of working on in the athletic department, so.
Yeah, so thank you for sharing that. So the suggestion here that there's a cultural thing happening as well. What is that? I mean, what's problematic about what's going on here? If anything.
I thought it was strange that it mentions a number of older students. Like, it was okay, somewhat okay if they were older students. And then the comment, they are adults. was also, so it's,
You mean in your train of thought?
yeah, in the train of
So
thought.
this is your train of thought, right? That you're thinking
Yes,
about.
so my train of thought is, are we going to say it's okay because they're older students? And are we gonna say, well, they're adults and they should be able to deal with it, or I'm somehow being paternal if I step in because they're adults? So I think that's in terms of the scenario, my train of thought is, why do those things matter? Why does it matter if they're older students, they're students? And why does it matter if we think they're adults, they're still in a situation that is a problematic situation for them?
Okay.
I think the cultural thing in this situation is that because you don't have supervisory responsibilities, like you're not required to report it or to tell someone. So like it seems like, yeah, their policies or their culture is like, if I'm not directly involved with that person, then it doesn't affect me or I shouldn't step in.
I also think the cultural piece is the charismatic member of your staff, he or she is well liked and seemingly an asset to the staff, and there is concern about how shifting their view amongst in the culture will impact the person who's observing the behavior.
For me, what was concerning was the words open secret.
Yeah.
Like, everyone knows about it, that's what I read it as. And then, so if you go and like report it, yeah, like, we know about it, so people know about it, but it's just kind of like, oh, yeah, I mean, it's happening. And what's gonna be done about it, like.
Or my concern is that they individualize it. He gets a pass or she gets a pass because, oh, that's just so-and-so being
Right.
so-and-so. Versus if this person was a horse's ass, you know, from the start, no one liked that person, would they be treated differently because they don't get a pass?
So it seems like, I'm gonna stop this, because it seems like so we're alluding to the it. So it's fascinating, it's a lot of I'm wondering, I'm asking sort of what's problematic about what's going on here, particularly as it relates to the culture. I'm curious about what's the it. So there's people who are, that seems to be he's popular and charismatic, this particular person. Is that necessarily bad to have a popular and charismatic person? There's people who have direct supervisory roles towards somebody, and then there's a peer group. I mean, is there anything particularly problematic about the fact that somebody supervises other people, and then there's peer dynamics, right? So I'm curious about sort of so some of the observations around sort of what's going on in the culture would be sort of circling around the sort of it here. Is there an it in terms of behavior that's going on here that this is a problem, or versus, hey, nothing to see here? I'm curious about that.
Well,
And it's not, it may seem odd, the answer to the question may seem obvious, so taking a step back a little bit from the scenario, well, it often is obvious, right? So just because we're asking the question, so slap shot. Guy pushes and slaps his girlfriend into a locker or at a party, wherever, nobody's doing anything. So what's problematic about that? One of the answers to that question, right, in an obvious way is, this guy just assaulted this person, right? So the idea is, okay, but so that's something to acknowledge, because for some people, right, in the course of the conversation, people might be a little, okay, well, how hard was it? Right? So so part of, again, sort of stepping back from our discussion of this, so part of the sort of initial asking of the question is what's problematic about this is to surface even the things that seem really obvious. Well, of course, it's sexist and racist, right? Yeah, so again, so this is about thinking about sort of some of the reasons why we may ask certain questions about the dynamics within the scenario, is to, even amongst some of the dynamics that, again, for some of us may seem really obvious, to state out loud that, yes, sexist and racist comments going on in the workspace, most people, is a problem in the workspace. Does that make sense? that some of, it feels like, wait a minute, this is wholly self-evident. Why would I need to focus on the thing that's problematic that's wholly self-evident? Because the presumption is, because the fact is, not everybody thinks like that. So let's start there in that space.
Whether it should be or not too, to me, the fact that it flat out says that it is emotionally devastating on the students, but it is having a severe impact on the people that it's happening. Because
Yeah.
that's, I mean, whether it should or not, that makes it even more important to do something, I don't know what, but like, it's.
Yeah.
And it, you know, the emotionally devastating views, you can imagine that's impacting them personally, but there are also students that's probably impacting their academics, it's impacting their relationships, it's impacting their entire life.
I also wonder, sometimes it's not helpful to actually name what kind of abuse it is. Sometimes I feel like we brush off verbal abuse like it's nothing. I don't know.
So go ahead.
Well, I mean,
Name it for you.
this is probably falling under verbal and emotional abuse. And so, you know, yesterday when we talked about, you know, kind of a progression, if you'd already done this activity, kind of nice to go back to this and say, okay, we're starting here with this. If we let this slide, you know.
Yeah, so what are some of the who? So if we're talking about verbally, emotionally abusive dynamics, behavior, impacting who and what potentially that's problematic.
What's impacting the students? It's also impacting the staff around this person.
And the fact that it's an open secret, it tells me that they've reaffirmed the behavior on the side of the person doing it, you know. So that overall culture.
Yeah, the culture, climate of the area.
And I also throw, it seems troublesome to me that this also seems like a faculty member kind of teaching her modeling sexism and racism. And so it's not just about that they themselves are doing those things, but they are let me shepherd you, older student about to go into the workforce, into doing that. And that's acceptable in the workplace.
Yeah, no, who are you speaking of?
But there are these older students that they're making these jokes with or talking about it with. Right?
Yeah, they're
So
they're
like those
teaching
who-
this
They're
behavior.
teaching, like the faculty member to me there is modeling or teaching that this is the
Yes.
acceptable conversation to have in the workplace. And so
Right.
it's not just that they are being, saying something racist, that they are showing another person here.
That's acceptable.
This is how you can act.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
So now you take that culture and you move it to the next step.
Which directly ties back to our question from yesterday. We're teaching them to expect those comments to come out of their workplace. It's like you paid her to say that.
Yeah, so it's playing out here as we sort of unpack, sort of wondering, is there anything problematic about this behavior that's going on here? So what is it specifically, right? So actually, we should name this. Unusual behavior, perhaps, right? Inappropriate in other ways. They're talking about, well, okay, so what's the impact? What's problematic? It's another thread of like, what's wrong here? What is the issue that needs to be addressed going on here? And we can think about, well, what impacts, potentially problematic impacts. This is verbally, emotionally abusive behavior towards students, right? It's not working, and we can follow the thread a little bit similar to what we did yesterday, talking about, so what is that? What are some of those negative impacts of this being felt by students and staff? How does it affect the space for students and staff? How might it degrade what it is that everyone's there to do, from achieving what you're supposed to be achieving in an academic setting, feeling like you can be the person that you can be, feeling like, again, many of these things echoing the conversations we had at the end of the day yesterday around what's the negative impact. of the sexist language that was happening in the statement that includes a culture of acceptance. Suddenly now this becomes the air we breathe, the water we swim in this space is this particular person, right? Starting with creating this space where people, number one, folks clearly at this point don't feel like they're able to confront this person around this, to do anything about it. But it just becomes the thing now that we're teaching ourselves and each other is what we should come to expect. Again, echoing some of what we talked about yesterday, it's like, so what's that? When we're in this space where we come to expect a thing that has such a negative impact on all of us.
Interesting to me that it says that your institution discourages people from this behavior. So my question was, well, okay, are they really discouraging that? One, and but it's kind of that disconnect sometimes too, where you have policies, but how well are your policies really? Are they just on the board statements, or the policies that are really trained or ingrained or discussed in a way that really is culture changing? Or is it just a checkbox?
Right. So this is always the question related to culture around and part of the challenge. So you have these written policies here, right? And this is a thread of discussion to potentially pursue. How well lived are these policies? How well lived? In some institute, well, how many of you know the mission and the values of the institution that you work for? Could you say, yeah, like I'm a soldier, duty, honor, courage. I know what that is. Whether that's lived in my barracks or not, I know what that is. How many of us know? I mean, is there for Grandview University? Is there a
Engage, equip, students to serve society.
Say, I'm sorry, say that.
Engage, equip, and empower students to serve society.
Engage, equip, and empower students to serve society. So if we were going to apply what was going on here to engage, equip, and empower students to better serve society, is that policy being lived here? Yeah. Who's your responsibility to here in this? In that scenario? All right, hang on. Hold on a space.
I say students in general, not just the current students, but also future students. It doesn't sound like it's a new thing.
I'm just gonna call this person the staff member. Students.
The institution as a whole.
Board. I'm gonna ask you a different one. How many of y'all feel like you would have an obligation or responsibility to yourself? And why? How many feel like you have a responsibility to yourself first? Why?
We were just talking about
I
that.
don't mean responsibility to yourself first. That was my first question.
Well, and we said too, like if you don't say something quickly, I tend to agonize over that. Like, oh my gosh, I should have done something. I should, and I stress out and worry about it on top of the situation itself, and it kind of compounds everything further. So that was part of it.
Or sometimes you feel like too much time has passed and it's kind of like that 24-hour rule happened just now.
But what is your responsibility yourself? What's the value and character that you feel like
I
you're
teach
holding on
this
behalf
stuff.
of yourself?
I teach this stuff to students. I mean, I can't be in a women and gender studies class and talk to students about this and then be in my work life and not do anything about it.
It's cognitive dissonance. Your values and your behaviors aren't matching up, and that causes a lot of stress and anxiety within yourself.
You and your hand up there too.
I think just, I don't know, like just moral compass is kind of like, if you see something, you do something, you hear something, you know, I just wouldn't, I agree with you, like, I wouldn't be able to, I don't know, I would hurt myself. I think like I would get so bothered by it just personally.
And the truth is, we have every right to have a workplace that doesn't have this kind of crap in it. I have every right to work and not have to deal with this. So I think that's fine.
I even think about the environment and I think about the environment and how if we're in an area of, well, particularly academia, we have to stop expecting it and start expecting people to do better, because if we don't, it doesn't raise their sense of responsibility to try to get to a different place. So here, you know, if we don't say it or whatnot, we just keep it going, and that you just keep, you know, watering a awful weed instead of a plant. So, you know, I guess you put into it, you get out of it what you put into it. And so if you're not going to put any work into trying to make it better, you know.
How about here? The staff member here. Who don't you feel like you have a sense of responsibility towards them? If so, why?
I think probably the approach to conduct that resonates with me the most overall is restorative justice, in the sense of like, yeah, someone's messing up, but there's still a responsibility to not just say like, well, we're gonna be completely punitive and you're gonna feel bad, and maybe that, you know, threat of a stick is gonna scare you into good behavior. I think there's a responsibility to actually have help that person through self-reflection and figure out what healthy behavior is and how, kind of what the problem is in the big picture as far as how they're approaching things.
Okay. Anybody else? Yeah.
I totally agree with that, and it kind of just reminds me of like anytime I've made a mistake or messed up, sometimes the punishment, again, I really like hold on to that phrase, shame kills learning. And so I feel like if I am invested in this person actually changing me, engaging with them in a way that actually gives them space to process it versus just be like, everybody's after me and I'm this terrible, awful, like that feels so meaningful. And so if I really care about them in either staying in this current job or their next job being successful, I feel like that it matters to me. Yeah.
How can we address this? So one of the factors in the scenario is it's like you are not the boss of this person. Right? Or you do not have a role in which you are designated to sort of address this sort of in a formal way. How might you? Go ahead. I mean, you all know what this is. I'm thinking about what's the how for you in this situation. Yeah.
So, I mean, it could be talking directly to that person, which for me, I think would have a lot to do with what kind of relationship that I have with them. So was it somebody that I had some connection with that I knew, in which case I would be more comfortable approaching them directly.
In what way? What would that sound like?
No, I want to talk with you about some things that I've been hearing from students about concerns and how you have been talking with and about them in different groups. And
Heidi, this is sounding ominous. What do you? Do I need a drink for this?
Probably not, but it is pretty serious, because what I'm hearing is that you're making comments that are really degrading to groups of students and other folks, and it's creating a hostile environment.
Whoa, come on. I mean, you know me, I'm just trying to have fun. I want this environment to be fun for everybody. People like when I engage with them.
And,
Like hostile environment, this sounds like a lawsuit. It sounds like I should get a lawyer here.
and I'm hoping that that's not what ends up needing to happen. And I recognize that your intention may not be to hurt anybody, but regardless of what you're intending to do, that's one of the impacts of your behavior, is that people are being hurt by the jokes that you're saying.
Okay. So thank you. What do you- Yeah.
I'm just kind of having a struggle with the scenario and how to approach from different scenarios, because everybody here works within the school. I don't. I'm a victim advocate in the county. So if I were to hear anything like this from a student or a faculty, I would first address it with that student or that faculty member, what they would want to do, and let them know that if they didn't report, they have that 10 years of statute of limitation that they can always report to law enforcement. So it's a little different from how we would handle things on our end and how universities would handle things on their end.
Well, that's one circumstance, right? So
Yeah.
you heard it from a student who had contact with this person in this way. But there's other ways you could hear about it as well, right? In your position. It's an open secret.
Right.
It's just something, so you hear people talking about that. So now you're in a position you know, but you didn't hear from a victim of any of this behavior. How might you handle that?
And that's where it makes it very hard. Who do you address? Like I would try to get a hold of that Title IX person in the school and address it that way.
So how would you approach that conversation, you think?
It just say, hey, this is what I'm hearing. And what makes it very hard is because interacting with a lot of law enforcement, a lot of the times, they're always gonna tell you, this is hearsay. If you don't have a person that can directly testify or give a statement, we have nothing here. So to directly approach somebody about their behavior, that can be hard as well, because then that person may come back and want to do a civil suit against you or something, because then now you're libeling that person's profession as well without any proof. You just have rumors and things like that.
So work it out. I mean, I know you're doing it. It's like all of the, I can't do this and I can't do that.
Right.
So these are things you can't do. I'm gonna come back.
Right.
You want something that you can do.
I was gonna say, I'm in a similar role as he is. I work with survivors, and for me, I go the protocol route, because talking to the person directly is not gonna be enough for me. And so that would look like making a report, and I mean, it's the school's obligation to investigate that report, whether they have the perpetrator, so they need to investigate that to some extent. And so to me, that's what that would look like, and that's how I would have to do that.
So I had a situation with a colleague that the student reported to me, that I then went to the colleague, and the student had a series of microaggressions, because we had been doing some training in microaggressions that had come up in class. And I wrote down each of them, so I didn't have to remember them. And then I went, thank you, and he's like, he wasn't filing a report, and he wasn't like, I need something to happen, but he wanted it to be informed, right? So then I was able to go to my colleague. Now, I'm the chair of the department, but we're still fairly much peers. I went, here's the situation, and this is how it was read. So I was able to I was the one who was able to transfer it, even though I wasn't the one that had observed it. And I didn't, but there was no lawsuit. There was not even any, this might impact your next promotion or something, but it was at least recorded. And so there was not, it was hearsay at a certain level, but he also didn't deny it. He read it very differently. He read it as, oh, I thought they were just comments I was making. I didn't mean anything by it. I went, well, yeah, this is how it came across. So I think sometimes when we get into, it could be a lawsuit or there will be some kind of judgment, we stop just addressing a person when I think we can address somebody we don't need to have the burden of proof to say to somebody, this is what I hear is going on.
And so one of the things that you're touching on here, and it's present, it's a thread that runs through almost every one of the scenarios, and a lot of the situation involving in the exercises is that you're leaning on the relationship that you have, that there's an established relationship here of some kind, right? That offers some kind of an anchor or a thread towards a conversation or towards an engagement or an interaction, right? And so thinking about sort of what's the opportunity in that, well, acknowledging that there's a challenge, because you even said, so here we go, I'm actually the supervisor here, but this is my friend. We've been calling many, that's a common occurrence where we were peers for a number of years. I became the chair. That doesn't mean the person who wasn't my friend and we were peers for 12 years is suddenly, right? You have to negotiate that particular dynamic, but there's those different types of dynamics in many relationships, right? Involving hierarchy, status, et cetera. So it's an opportunity to sort of explore that piece of it. I mean, your example fit there, but there are others potentially here, right? And the other piece I don't want to lose, and we'll have a chance to, so that's Chanel, I'm gonna run out of the room. Institutional response. So how might you approach this in a way, and again, we'll get a chance to, in a couple of the scenarios, to talk about this explicitly, perhaps. How do you approach it in a way where this is an issue? I don't think I can approach this particular person. I don't feel like I have the evidence in that way, but I know this is enough of it that's going on. I want to do something here. I want my office, my organization to figure out something to do. What might that be? How might you approach that?
Talk to their supervisor.
Talk to their supervisor in the hopes of doing what? That they'll talk to individually the person? Here's what I'm thinking about. We're in a session here now. Oftentimes in the work that I do, I get called in, there's an incident, right? And within a few weeks or a few months, now we're talking to everybody. And there's a sense among some people on the staff, well, this is a response, everybody in here knows this is a response to what's been going on, right? So thinking about, is there an opportunity to use the hierarchy, right, in some way to request or suggest of them, hey, we need something in here, right? I don't feel like I have the strings or the relationship, or I can't figure out a way in here specifically or in here, and this isn't really relevant, right, to address this in a way that I feel comfortable with. But I do expect my institution, I have an expectation or hope that my institution is going to respond to this in some way. And so and again, your imagination around what might those things be to get away from the fight or flight. Because I just can't see my way through a conversation with this person that I feel like, number one, I could do, or maybe I feel like I can do it. I just don't know if it's going to be effective. Like I can say all those things that I'm saying. I just think by the time he closes the door, or they close the door behind me, it's like, yeah, out of here. And that doesn't feel good to me either. So now what? And perhaps this is in combination. And sometimes we'll ask about, is there one or is there a combination of things that you feel like you want to do in a situation like this? Does that make sense? Okay. So one last thing before we transition out of here that I wanted to address in terms of the structure of scenarios, the way they're designed, sort of in the purpose of them. And that is the role of the train of thought in the scenario, right? So it was interesting. There were several comments related to when I was asking what was problematic about this, was sort of focusing on the train of thought. It's like, well, I don't like this piece of it, right? Which is fine, right? So sort of personally, but again, I'll use Slapshot as an example, where you've got pushes and slaps his girlfriend at a party in a public setting, nobody's doing anything. Part of the train of thought is, actually switch that. I'll do a legal motion. This is a very cleaner example. So see a friend, see a male friend, you see a guy trying to take a drunk girl home. She's stumbling over her own feet. She's out of it. Or this is your friend, you see a guy in school. Sort of what do you do? And one of the parts of the train of thought is, I mean, this could be, nothing, right? It could be, or what? He might not even listen to me. So there's always an element of, I really feel like this is a problem that I kind of feel like I should do something about, but always within the train of thought, there are elements of why not? There are always elements of the narrative in someone's mind that may try to be talking them into not doing anything, right? And that's there on purpose, by design, right? For many reasons, not the least of which is that's realistic, right? We want people to read these scenarios and feel like, yeah, my thinking around this is represented here in some way. Because if it simply reads, right, the party line, well, this is what I'm supposed to, this is what I feel like people are supposed to think, or are full of right answers, this just doesn't resonate with people. And you don't get a chance in some ways to address some of those dynamics if it sort of reads flatly that way. Does that make sense? Okay. Because one of the things involved in moving forward and sort of teaching other people to facilitate scenarios is coming back to the understanding that the scenario is the anchor of the conversation. The dynamics, down to the word in many respects, are there for a reason. Like, I'll use a legal motion again as an example. She's not just drunk, she's stumbling over her own feet. Right, is a detail in that that's in that on purpose. It wasn't in the original, I don't believe, the very original version of the legal motions, but it added that piece of it that add a point of the situation where there's not any ambiguity anymore about how drunk this person is. Which still doesn't mean that it doesn't occur all the time, where people see that situation and decide not to do anything, but it does add that piece of it within the conversation. It just has, that is the inflection that you're able to come back to, sort of anchor the discussion. But the point is that the wording of the scenarios, the design is to anchor the conversation. That regardless of where it goes during the course of the discussion, some of that can be really important. That you can come back to this. Okay, so we talked about this, but this is what's going on here. So we talked about this element, sort of the hypothetical, et cetera. What if this is your supervisor type of thing? Because that could be a really important thread. Okay, so let's come back to this though, because it doesn't say whether or not this is a peer or your supervisor or not. So let's deal with what's going on here that we have in front of us. Does that make sense? About it being the anchor? Okay, so anything that questions that add from the side of your thinking?
I appreciate hitting on the impact, like what's the impact of what's happening in the scenario, then the responsibility piece. If you look in the main goals of MVP in the first section of the binder, that's reinforced in there as well in terms of getting at that. What responsibility do I have of myself, the person who's being targeted, my institution, those, so Carol, thanks for walking us through those pieces. Those would be a staple for all of our scenarios. So appreciate that.
Take a picture of this. I have pictures of it as well, just so that way, and if you want any of the information, I can pass it along.
Yeah, I'm not gonna read some, I'm just gonna put it over.
Sorry. Debbie, I have pictures of all of this stuff, so if you want, if there is something that you need, let me know, or if there's something.
I was gonna take pictures of the papers, but I was afraid he was, I didn't wanna break the stride if he was going to erase it.
Right, so I just took the pictures this morning, so if there's something you need, I can send them to you. Yeah?
Okay.
I know what we're saying.
So we wanted to take a, let me ask first, who has not either participated in or facilitated the gender box exercise?
As part of MVP, I haven't, but I've read Jackson Katz's book when I taught women in gender studies.
Okay.
Done some of that.
Well, all right.
Commit, Mindy, commit.
We're gonna do the reveal version of this. So the reveal, actually, it's the cooking show version, isn't it? So the cooking show version is we start to make the meal.
Get your ingredients.
Oh, but I've got faith. It's been in the oven all along. It's delicious. Yeah, I don't know. I have feelings about that from my childhood. I don't know why I always felt like I wanted to watch that thing big.
Right.
Like I felt like that. So, I think the way that we'll go about this is, as obviously that you saw, there's a semi-baked or baked version. Which never makes me think of an oven, first and foremost, underneath here. But I think what we'll begin, we'll start this exercise in a way that sometimes we'll begin either one of these exercises and get us into it, and then begin to sort of debrief some of the points I think that we felt like may be useful to walk through, right? So before we begin, to help us sort of start this exercise as part of the training, the question for the group sort of help us with, right? And the question for the group is, what is the difference between someone's sex and someone's gender? Was that a trick question? Sex is by, can you say more about that?
So for me, sex is, and there's different, so you look at the stereotypical two main ones, male, female, gonads, testicle, penis. There's also intersex, 4,000 around there, people want intersex, so you got that going on. So I always look at sex as being more of a biological as far as genitalia, parts, chromosomes, that type of thing.
Okay, and so therefore gender?
Gender is a little bit hard. I use the gender breadman to explain all of this, and I'm so proud of the gender.
Can you do take a bite off the gender breadman? Just the arm. Just the arm. All right, that's all right. I want to make you sort of work. Somebody have
the expression of your masculinity and femininity.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Well, so here's a way to often sort of close this piece of it out. So yes, sex generally relates to our biological designation, sort of how we're born, the parts that we come out with, right? And for many people, that comes down to whether someone's born male or female. And as you suggested, there's more choices than that, right? So we may have an opportunity to get into that at some point, other point. Gender relates to how we are socialized to behave or may identify with in relation to our sex, right? Again, there are more complex, so I'll say this a little bit sort of stepping out of the exercise and sort of talking about the facilitation. There are more complex, frankly, jargonistic, whether or not this is the vision for how we want to talk about this in the future or not, ways of describing this, right? That I would suggest are not particularly useful here. But think about the premise of the question. And oftentimes I'll ask that question and 3/4 or 90% of the space is staring blankly at me. What are you talking about? That's a trick question, right? So think about the answer to your question being this string, right, of gender theory dialogue, and how that would actually translate to someone who's literally first hearing for the first time in a conversation that there's a distinction at all, right? So this is the part of sort of MVP programmatically, facilitation programmatically, is about how do we have these conversations with people in a constructive way that invites them into the discussion in a way that once they're there, we can begin to unpack and break down some of these things. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's the clearest reason example I can give as to why gender is how we're born, right? The parts that we're born with in some ways are described, and gender relates to how we are socialized to behave or may identify in relation to our sex. And an example of, and I think you started talking about this, but I'm sorry, I certainly can't read Hindi. Yeah, I apologize, they're really small. Yesterday where you talked about, and I have a friend who does this work that talks about this in the same way. He says, he's a little kid. He ended up having a sister that was 3, 4 years younger than him. He's a little kid, boy, 3, 4, 5 years old. He's running around the neighborhood. He falls down, skins his knee, gets up, he's running, crying. His dad is there, and his response to him is like, "Hey, what's going on here? Yeah, quit your crying. Rub a little dirt in it. Just sort of rub a little dirt in it." He says a few years later, again, he's got this little sister. She's a similar age. He's watching this take place. When she runs, falls down, skins her knee, gets up, starts running to dad. He scoops her up, starts giving her little kisses. "What's wrong with my old baby? Let me make it better for you." And he's standing there still as a kid looking at this going, "Hey, what happened? That's what I want. What happened to rub a little dirt in it?" Right? How come I couldn't get that? Right? And it was clear to him the response that dad gave to both of them had everything to do with the fact that he was a boy and his sister was a girl. Right? Another example, Alan. Actually, who's got $1?
Here you go.
I think we have $1.
Yeah, here you go.
Everybody's got $1 with these answers.
Jerk.
That's a good one, I gotta try
I'm getting $5 from that. I didn't keep it. Who's this? Who is he? Who was he? He was a president? First president. Anything else? He was just a general? Yeah, he didn't know he could have history. Well, this is funny, because some groups rattle this off a little bit, right? So he was the commanding general of the Revolutionary Army, right? The general of the sort of first time. What else was there? What was he around for? Revolutionary, go ahead, I can't.
So he was a founding father.
He's considered a founding father. He's around for Declaration of Independence, right? He's one of the, was he not a signing?
But he oversaw the constitutional.
I'm sorry, yeah, he was the person who oversaw the Constitutional Convention. He's considered one of the founding fathers of the country, etc. He is, yeah. Right. He was, by all accounts, in his time, we might refer to him in this contemporary terms as being the man, right? He was kind of the man in that moment. In fact, in as a president, I still think he was talking about being a giant of a man. Is he the second tallest president still in history? He's either the second or third tallest president still in history. He was 6'3" or 6'4". In his time, literally a giant. He reached the pinnacle of masculine achievement in many respects that you could describe it. So I'm going to take George Washington, circa 1778. Right? and put him in a time machine and spit him out in any town, America, 2018. And George Washington spits out of the time machine, he comes out, and he's wearing, I can't quite tell, is that like a wig, white curly wig? He has on his face that kind of have locks and they're covering part of it. It looks like he might have some like base on his face. It sort of cuts off here and blends into a blouse. That's sort of what sort of frills kind of in the front that come underneath the kind of a jacket that comes down tight and might have some tails on the back. We don't know. And begin to cover looks like a pair of like tights. They may be gray that disappear into a pair of high boots, knee-high boots that may have sort of heel in the back. And he may sort of walk out. I don't know if he's got a cane, very sort of erudite pose as he's walking out. Depending on what neighborhood George Washington lived out in, what might happen to George Washington?
It's scary to think.
Well, yeah, but I'm asking.
It just depends, like, if you fall into the wrong neighborhood.
Yeah, he may be the subject of any kind of some kind of ridicule. He may get harassed, catcalls. Some places he may risk. He may just get his ass kicked. Just for dressing the way that he's dressed. So think about that. In the short history of this, so America's been around compared to some countries for a relatively long time. Compared to other countries, America hasn't been around very much at all. The short history of this country, what it takes to be considered the man, right? Someone who's achieved the pinnacle sort of masculine status, right? What it takes to be considered that person and revered as that person might potentially change, or has in some places, almost 180 degrees, just based on the superficial metric of what it is that he decided, or what it was that was accepted in terms of appearance, right? It's simply the way that this person dressed. And so what about that story? What it does is suggest, or actually more than suggest, it actually signifies one of the ways in which gender, the performance of, the way that I'm supposed to sort of step into my role of my sex, can and does change over a period of time. Right? There are other ways that we can signify this, as you know, that are true, but one of the ways this is true, that you can prove this, is literally just pull $1 out your pocket. And so with that, who?
Thanks.
Thank you. So this would start here, right? Whoops, I already screwed that up, didn't I? How about that? 2B, A. Whatever, I don't like how that looks. You can draw these out or not. More often than not, probably would have left that without the box on it. But the question becomes, so I want us to sort of think about characteristics, right? Stereotypical characteristics, like boy is blue, girl is pink, George Washington's a man, George Washington's in drag, right? Stereotypical characteristics of what it means to be a man. Right? And so what are some of those? You think about some of them from this group. What might that be? 2, 3, 4. Tough.
Stoic. Strong.
Well, if I'm tough and I'm strong, what am I supposed to know how to do?
Fight.
Fight. We don't necessarily start fights, but we're supposed to know how to what? Yeah.
My mind went to fix it.
That's true.
You're supposed to fix
You're supposed
things.
to fix my sink.
You're supposed to fix things.
It's to fix it, yeah. Yeah.
Grills, you can grill.
Yeah, grills. You're supposed to know how to cook. Where are you not supposed to necessarily cook?
In the kitchen.
Yeah. But once it fire,
grill
but
is
that's just
fire,
to
yeah.
start a fire.
Hunter?
So Eddie Murphy, no, that's a fire. What was that whole thing? His uncle was, he didn't like how his fire was too namby-pamby. He's like, yeah, no, that's not how you do it. Right? Do you remember that clip? Or is that, am I Eddie Murphy, am I dating myself? Okay.
Oh, yeah.
So, I want to shift gears here because so there are different threads around appearance. So I might ask, what type of job are you supposed to have? You're supposed to be a nurse or a kindergarten teacher?
Construction work.
Doctor, lawyer.
Construction worker, doctor, lawyer, right? CEO, some sort of hard hat job, right? Who are you supposed to be on the job? Either way.
Manager.
Yeah, you're the boss. How much money are you supposed to make?
More than your wife.
Yeah, all the money, and especially, yeah, more than your wife, right? More than your partner. So several of these threads are already listed here, right? So who are you supposed to be in a relationship with?
A woman.
Really? Anybody you choose? Any dude on the street?
Any female, any.
Oh, I see. So that's a requirement here?
Inside the package, inside the box.
Yeah, all right, so what does that make you?
Firmly should have straight, big boobs.
Yeah, so I don't know if you put that down here. So heterosexual. Yeah, how many women are you supposed to have? Yeah, what are you supposed to be doing with those women?
Lots of sex.
Who are you supposed to be having lots of sex with? Or what?
Oh, you're dead.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, but just any old dick?
You're amazing.
Let go see it, right?
Yes.
Where is this going?
Everybody got really uncomfortable.
So this not to say that there's not like laugh, that people wouldn't laugh in the group when we're split group, but this is one of the reasons why, beyond the obvious in terms of what's in here in the conversation, but it's also, you can just like, yeah, I mean, I'll ask that question in the group. And yeah, it's the same, it could be some laughter is kind of like, oh, yeah, but we all know what this means, right? Just like everything else in here that we can look at and think about that comes off as cartoonish when we think about it in a serious way. It's like this can come off as cartoonish. As we move forward here, we're going to talk a little bit about what's designated or what can be considered really kind of this is a cartoon. This is a caricature. It has deep and serious implications, doesn't it? Like there are deep and serious implications around the anxiety experienced by a lot of men about what this standard is supposed to be. And as again, we'll talk about a little later, is it doesn't just impact men that have anxiety about this, does it? It seems pretty obvious. Think about it that way. Okay. So we've got, context. So it's not just any sport. There's no badminton, right? Or table tennis here. It's contact sports, collision sports. By the way, you like sports. What are you supposed to be actually in relation to sports? A winner. Okay, so winner, competitive.
The best.
Physically though.
Ripped.
Big.
Ripped.
Okay. So we got big, tall, muscular, athletic, right? So you don't just like sports. I'm supposed to be good at sports in that way, right? I don't just drink any drink. No foo-foo drinks, nothing with umbrellas in it. It's beer and hard liquor and whiskey. I drink my boys under the table, right? I'm not a vegetarian. No vegan, none of that stuff. I eat meat. We're meat eaters around here, right? And some of this stuff is even more pronounced depending on where you're from, type of thing. And so I can imagine this resonates pretty well here as well. See, we're here in, beef capital, central of the United States, around here, that there are implications related to some of this that are not just around gender, but around economics too, aren't they? Okay. So the point inside is that there are any number of threads around how you may dress, the car you're supposed to drive. By the way, what car are you supposed to drive? A Neon? Prius? Yeah. Some sort of muscle car.
Yeah.
Right, trucks, 4x4, or some sort of muscle car. How fast are you supposed to drive, by the way? 55?
Real fast.
Yeah, 55, if it's a 25, sometimes you hear.
When the minivan starts passing, you gotta speed up. That's not acceptable.
Right, so the idea is it's about, so these answers in many respects become automatic, but part of the solicitation and answers is about the types of questions we may ask. That's what solicit them, the touch points inside the culture that we understand about, again, appearance, right? The things that you're supposed to have, the relationships you're supposed to have, right? The character of those relationships, the money, the cars, the emotions. It says no emotions here, right? The one emotion you're definitely not supposed to show is crying, that type of thing. And then, so taking a look at all of these things, regardless of what else we might come up with. Question is, how many of y'all know any guy that lives down all of these characteristics here?
And if they do, like, you don't like them.
Well, yeah, but I prefer questions first, though. I mean, I actually know, other than the Dos Equis man and the character of Chuck Norris is supposed to be. Does anybody know anybody that actually does all this stuff? Yeah, I don't either, right? And so that's an important thing to acknowledge.
I know a lot of students who really try to fill that.
Okay,
I mean,
so-
really, and some of them actually
So-
come really close. I know,
Right, so time out. So the second question is, how many of you all know guys who try to live this down? How many of y'all know guys that are trying to live this down? Yeah. What type, or what's it like to be around these guys?
Annoying.
Right? What type of friends generally are guys that are trying to live this down?
Same friends that.
Selfish one.
They feel like they're selfish ones? Yeah, what type of relationships or intimate relationships do you feel like guys who are trying to live this down can have?
Superficial.
Superficial, they don't really as much. Are there any destructive or self-destructive things you think guys that are trying to live this down all the time may engage in? Like what? They drink a lot.
Sex.
So somebody said, okay, so sex, is that necessarily bad?
Unsafe.
Oh, unsafe sex, gotcha.
Probably depressed because they're trying to be a box rather than being
Yeah. Some of these things don't mix very well either, do they?
So violence outside of the appropriate context.
Yeah. Right? So when we think about it and talk about it in this way, it's actually not really working out for these guys. Is it? Certainly not in terms of our impression of them or how we feel about being around them. So that's an important sort of piece, again, for me in terms of sort of setting up the element of what's happening in here to get to, so the next question is, regardless of what we just discussed here, what are some of the names you risk being called if you fall outside of the behaviors prescribed in here? And sometimes at this point, I'll actually make again, you have to make the box now, once we're done with this, let me draw a box around here. So what might you be called? And so, by the name, are there any proper names here? No proper names.
You mean like a person's name? You mean like Nancy?
What else?
Does anybody say that anymore?
No, I've never heard
I
that.
can't remember the name, but I did this in a middle school, and they used a football player's name. Had recently come out or
Right, right.
Oh.
So part of the point is there always is. There has been, so, I mean, these are the classics, right? But somebody will say Alice, but yeah, there's always updates. And generally, the younger the group who fills us out, the younger the group that fills us out, they'll come up, there's something here that's creative.
I didn't know a lot of
Yeah.
that. I'm glad a student's with me when I do it, 'cause I'm like, you gotta spell that, I have no idea.
Yeah, and so, I mean, it's cheeky on the one hand, but on the other hand, I mean, this is important because this is as we know, as we start the debrief, but this is the language of the policing, isn't it? Right? So it becomes the sort of, I don't want to say the currency, but this is the stick, literally. And the appreciation that the stick is always evolving, right? From a club to something that's more high tech now, if you will, right? But always with the same effect. And almost always under the same dynamics or the same character, because what are the things you find are in common with this? Anything that you notice that these terms have in common with one another? We could add to this.
Yeah.
So, literally, the sort of names, woman, girl, yeah, mama's boy, anything.
Sissy.
Yeah. Specifically, right? Okay, this is where left read. Well, by the way, what's the combination of what two words?
Woman and.
Right? So you've got many of these other terms, most of these other terms, right? And including going back to your point where the name, right? So that name is not a girl's name or a woman's name, it's the name of a man that's come out, right? Is a way of calling out the sexuality of another guy. And what's the stereotype we have of gay men? Is they act like what?
A girl.
Right. So even within that, it's a way to feminize a man. And so what that begs is, if the common thread for almost all of these terms comes back to femininity, is what does that suggest in terms of how we feel about women?
Pretty misogynist.
Yeah, what's the relationship between being in here and here?
If women are inferior and you're supposed to be superior, you're strong, you're supposed to be.
Yeah, this is a superior to inferior relationship by definition, isn't it? And so when you think about if one group of people feels that they are superior to another group of people, how do they generally treat those people? And can you think of any historical examples of how this is played out?
You mean, like, I don't know, current politician who like had an affair with and then paid off a porn star?
Historical.
So that
Yeah.
I
I know, yeah, you want to get that out. Yeah, slavery.
Denying the right to vote.
For
Women
black
not being
people.
allowed to.
Yeah, so certainly women, the other examples are beyond the gendered example.
Oh,
gotcha.
So we have slavery, anti-Semitism, the Holocaust, Native American, the genocide, or as we were taught in school, manifest destiny, right? We got a euphemism for that here. It hasn't worked out for them, has it? In a serious way. So how does this come back to what it is that we're here talking about, or this training around these issues? Well, one of the ways that you may be able to think about this is that sort of understanding the relationship between here and here begins to potentially explain some people's behaviors and attitudes. Because if I'm a guy whose relationship with women, whose understanding of his relationship with women is mediated by this system, then some of my behavior starts to actually make sense, right? Because if I've got in a relationship and my woman is acting outside of accordance to the way that this works, then I may need to make a correction in that relationship to make sure she knows her place, right? If I'm the type of guy whose understanding of masculinity's relation to femininity is mediated by this, and I'm out at the club or party and I'm trying to get my player game on, and this woman isn't sort of down with that, I may need to just sort of take what it is I need to take from her and make sure that I maintain my reputation and appearances, yeah. If I'm the type of guy whose understanding of masculinity's relation to femininity is mediated by this, and I'm on the job and I have a woman who's a supervisor over me, well, I may need to like act out on the job in a way that makes her and the people around me know what time it is and whose place should be where, right? Get my Don Draper on sometimes, what to say. Like, if my understanding of the way genders relate to one another is mediated by this, then, right, that starts to track whether we agree with it or not. If my understanding of the way masculinity relates to femininity is mediated by this, then some of people's behavior as bystanders start to make some sense too, right? Because, hey, I'm a bystander to this. Hey, that's just a man handling his business in a relationship the way a man's supposed to, right? That's just a player, like trying to do his thing, right? I'm not trying to cock block him. That's not my role. My role is something else, right? If I'm a colleague or a guy and I see a guy acting out like this and my understanding of the way gender is supposed to work is mediated by this, it's like, well, listen, I can empathize, right? I mean, look at him. He's a man trying to take care of his family. He's got some woman, right, in a position of authority over him. So part of this is a way to think about potentially getting serious about some of the root causes or some of the dynamics that have been leading to the seriousness of the issue that, and again, we didn't do, there's a serious problem of some men being abusive towards women in this country, ADU, but if we had, in 80 or 90 or 100% of the group is in agreement that there's a serious problem, okay. Well, if we're in agreement that there's a serious problem, and here we are as leaders, as men and women, et cetera, who are looking to try and do something about it, and we want to get serious about this, well, maybe it's time to get serious about some of these dynamics that we may have thought past as being part of some of the root causes of this, if we want to be serious about it. And so there are a couple pieces about inside here that are important here. This is kind of obviously a bellwether in terms of the exercise here where you're trying to get people to consider the way this has worked in their lives and the way this continues to work in the culture is, number one, if you look at the characteristics in here, is it necessarily a bad thing to be heterosexual or athletic? Or yeah, I'm not gonna point.
The answer's no.
Just saying.
Right. It's not necessarily but what about the way that this system works can turn some of these even so innocuous characteristics potentially bad or might pervert any or all of what these characteristics may represent? What about this system can corrupt any or all of it?
Well, part of it's the rigidity. So it's like, I am
Yeah, what am I doing?
always strong. Yeah. Exactly, you can't go out of the box.
Yeah. So amongst the guys that are in here, how many of y'all are defined, if by nothing else, that set of characteristics described here? Like you're nothing else but a combination of any or all of these characteristics. Raise your hand if that describes you. Yeah, it doesn't describe any of us. Any of us in here as men are more than what's in here if we're any of it. And so it begs the question, any system of belief or behavior that doesn't allow you to be the human being that you actually are, how can that be a healthy system at all, right? And again, this by very nature, as somebody just said, right, defines who it is that you're supposed to be by a narrow set of characteristics. Do you have a piece about this? This was a setup, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
I asked you for stereotypes, didn't I? Because if I had asked you for your new age 2019 coming up version of characteristic of being a man, we might have come up with some different characteristics in here than what we did. And in fact, some of us recognize, whether we're men and women, we recognize that, well, first starting with guys, that we're living different lives than our fathers do related to it. Is that true for some of us? Some of us have sons that are living different lives around this stuff than we did. Yeah? Some of us might recognize that our dads live different lives than our grandfathers did in relation to this, because things have changed around what this can be or not. Is that true? So if it's true, one of the things it reinforces is something I suggested in the beginning, that gender is something, is a dynamic in the culture that can and does change if we want it. So we have the will to do that. The idea that gender, the performance of it is some sort of static thing is a fiction, right? This is living and breathing, and we continue to make that so. And we can more if we choose to be. But the other thing that's true about this, and it was similar to what I asked you yesterday, I'll finish this sentence for me. What's also true is we started over here, we started strong. When I ask what goes inside the box, everybody knows what goes inside the box. When I ask the terms about what goes outside the box, everybody knows these terms that go outside the box. Some of us know older terms, some of us newer terms. It doesn't matter. We can fill it up in a matter of minutes. So what that means is this dynamic, these ideas are at work in the culture. When everyone knows the rules of the game, it could be suggested the game's still playing us. And so we've already attested to the fact that, well, we don't really like these guys. And if we're trying to be anybody else, by definition, it's not working out for us, is it? And that includes, oops. That includes this over here, doesn't it? I'm gonna leave this down here a little bit. It's not, some of you are not gonna be able to read that, but this is important to think about. Because if the superior to inferior relationship exists here and everything outside here, most of it signifies femininity. Well, literally the entire existence of femininity, inside the box or outside the box, exists in an inferior place to this one. And if we think there's a problem with this dynamic, a circumstance that doesn't allow us to be the people that we are, extending to feeling superior, right? In a characterization of a person, of a man, to the characterization of a woman, or a person that doesn't identify as a man in the binary at all, existing by definition as less than, if that's a condition that we feel like is detrimental to who it is that we want to be and how it is we want to live together, then does that suggest that we need to do something to confront the way that these things work? And if so, what might that be? Be one concrete thing walking out of this particular exercise that any of us might be able to do to confront the way that the system works. One concrete thing.
Creates a platform for all these forms of abuse.
Yeah, no question. No question. What's the one concrete thing that any of us could potentially do to confront the way that this works?
Challenging.
You could commit to not using those words.
Right? It's pretty concrete, isn't it? What are these words for?
Hurting, minimizing.
Separation.
Keeping people apart.
Yeah, right? What are these arrows? I already started writing the arrows in there, right? Like this language. This didn't show up here, did it? This language is an important one.
It's on the women box.
It is?
Yeah.
Yeah. Because it is the one word that shows up outside of both boxes consistently. But we understand that these terms, language, and again, it's important to point out that we're talking about words here. So this is like the sticks and stones piece, right? Sometimes I didn't ask you this group, but I'll ask it. Now, if you use some of these terms in the direction of some guys might, should you be, depending on who they are, ready to fight those guys because they will fight you? Yeah, that's how serious people take this. Right, it's one of the metrics that illustrates how seriously this is taken. That these terms literally keep people, are designed to keep people in here. Lift up your skirt, stop being such a pussy, and have another drink. I mean, we've developed a whole language, there's a poetry to it, isn't there? Right? That sounded pretty, like, how many of you here haven't heard something like that? A string of these put downs connected together in a way to deliver a message to a guy. Yeah. And as simple as this is to see, it's different from it necessarily being easy to do, right? Because as natural as that sounds, stop being a little bitch, have another drink. Stop being such a pussy, put your foot on the gas, right? Right? Come on, little girl, come on, ladies, put your back into it, right? On and on, related to that. As common as that sounds, suggests how ubiquitous it is. Because go ahead and raise your hand in this room. I'll ask it in this room as I would ask it in any room. Raise your hand if you've never used these terms or any term like it in the direction of a guy. I mean, I can't raise my hand either, right? And some of you may be struggling a little bit, right? So this is a mixed group. This isn't an exercise design in this group. It's practically 100% in the hundreds, if not thousands of times that we've done this exercise and asked that question. Nobody raised their hand. So what that suggests, as I suggested earlier, is how much this is embedded in how we relate to one another. And if it's embedded that deeply, perhaps, again, the suggestion is this is something we need to come back to and take seriously in terms of what the implications are on how we behave towards one another. So a couple of important things about this, the generation of what goes on inside this box versus outside this box for the women's box or the female box is very similar. But some of the pieces that come out of this that are consistent that can be important is how much of, to an extreme degree, how much of what's inside this box is sameness related to subservience or appearance. how much of these characteristics are about what you're supposed to be doing for somebody else, and damn sure not yourself as a woman, and how you're supposed to look as a woman, versus as unctuous as this can feel, there's a lot of diversity going on in here. Right? In terms of some of these pieces, so much of this is I'm weak, subservient, I'm supposed to be, look this way, I'm thick, I'm skinny. A lot of it is literally schizophrenic. I'm here and I'm there at the same time. Lady in the streets, freak in the sheets, right? We don't, yeah, that's cheeky, funny, etc. Except if you're actually trying to live a life, right? In accordance to how you're supposed to be, that's literally polar opposite to one another. What that might suggest in terms of what it feels like to live as a woman in the culture, or somebody identified as a woman in the culture. And then again, by extension around this, is thinking about any of us who identify and want to live our lives outside of how this binary is defined. That's literally rendered invisible by what the binary defines as who you're supposed to be as a human being, doesn't it? Okay. Way more time on that one, but any questions, thoughts, reflections on, some of you, I can tell, hadn't done this at all before. Some of you have done or been a part of it, others have facilitated it. Anything about this? I'll try to answer some things here in a moment. There's others that we may be able to parking lot because we do have to transition out of this so we can get your practice in.
I know it was created with the purpose of having mixed gender groups, or with separate gender groups. Obviously, in this setting, we're not that way, we're not split up. And in some of the settings that we walk into to do sessions, that's not necessarily an option. I guess, what's the importance of one way or the other? I understand I get the importance, but is it detrimental, I guess, to have it in a mixed gender group, or should we try as much as possible to separate?
Yes, the answer is yes to your second question.
Okay.
The other answer to your question has a lot to do with what's your agenda, what are you trying to do in your session? You may make a choice of doing one versus the other based on who's here, what are we trying to do within this session, right? Is the short answer to both those questions. But ideally, yeah, just like the scenarios, these elements are designed for these conversations to be explicit.
Can I ask a clarifying question?
Yes.
When you ask your question, are you separating like men and women, or men, women, and a third sex group?
It depends on your ability, but yeah.
Okay, because see, I haven't done that training, so that's why I was like, is your question, do you do this to all men or all women groups? Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Maybe that's a parking lot thing, because I think that there's a pretty deep conversation. I mean, even in the time from when I first did training to now, the students that I deal with, there's a great deal of gender fluidity. We get more and more students who are coming in who are transitioning. And so then I think it becomes harder to say, let's just split into two groups, because we're also busy teaching that this notion of binary is wrong, and then we're asking to put them in a binary to do the grouping. So I think it's gotten complicated even in 3-4 years.
Yeah.
So
those determinations are so again, what I articulated originally is sort of if that setup can work, it's an ideal location to get to have the group split. You can, and it can be up to you using your judgment in terms of, again, who's in the room, right? What's more useful for what's happening in the room? It's like, we're all going to stay together and we're going to do this piece. We're going to talk this through. What can't be and shouldn't be, because it defeats the purpose, right, of what it is that we're trying to unpack here, is that we're examining this binary, right? And so, again, how you position the space, right, and who's in the space, right, and how you want to split is sort of wholly up to what you feel like is appropriate for the group.
Can you say again
That this is a mailbox, this is a female box and a mailbox, right? That the construction of this is sort of to examine how it is, and some of you may be creative to sort of think about how this may work in communities that are non-binary, right? Like that hasn't been developed in terms of the box, but I would suggest that needs to fit in some way with a deconstruction of, because we're still living in this, right? Every one of us is still living within a culture that's defining who it is, right? That's rigidly defining these pieces in a way that's creating problems for all of us, right? That's the sort of point of this.
I was just gonna say the same. When I've led this activity, I think initially with our students, because like Jennifer said, there is a growing acceptance, understanding that there's a lot more fluidity there. I think we get some pushback at first, or just some like I don't like that binary. Talking with them about, we're not talking about your lived fluid experience. We're talking about the stereotypes that you are living within and being expected to sort of ascribe to, and how that impacts us. And so whether we are seeing more acceptance of that fluidity doesn't impact the stereotype that we're also, so just being prepared to have that conversation at some point, I think, especially with our younger students who are shifting in the ways that they think about some of this, is, I think, just an important thing.
That should be part of the discussion. That should be part of the discussion, as it was the suggestion, again, that we're living different lives than our dads did in relation to this, is a springboard to sort of part of the conversation. But again, it's important not to subsume, right, in the same way that we're asking for stereotypes in here for a reason. And that, again, by the time we get to the end of the exercise, that reason is revealed. It sort of it unfolds as we go.
And I often will say that to people at the start, like that this looks like we are trying to operate according to that binary, but you will see as we go why talking about these stereotypes in this way is really important for all of us, no matter where we fall on that continuum. And so, in some ways, preparing people for that. And I don't know that is necessary, but I found that helpful when I get that pushback from students a little bit.
Yeah, that's a little harder to, so sometimes I'll like, in terms of the expectations, is set up to sort of ask people to sort of follow through this. We're gonna get to a place at the end without necessarily trying to explain everything that we're doing in here before we actually do it. I tend to sort of shy away from that piece of it, sort of over-explaining or over-apologizing in the beginning in some way, versus, hey, you set up expectations in the beginning, like this is all part of a journey here. And some of your discomfort around this, resistance to it, is part of the point. Right? It's part of what it is that we want to talk about, and how those dynamics are playing out for us, right? We're here in this space, we're an MVP, in part to expand our skill sets around what we understand about these issues, and how that we can behave out in the world outside of the space in a way that helps all of us feel safe. That's what we're doing in here, right? Sorry.
No, you're good.
Last comment, we got to transition.
No, I just, and this can be a print on or whatever. Why so strongly does it work the best for it to be separated? Do you think?
For the same reason that it works more strongly for us to have the scenario conversation. It just opens up. It creates a safe for a lot of people who are coming into these conversations. It's just a safer space. It's a more open space. It's like I can say the things I can have in this group. It was fine. When I asked this question and people were laughing, etc. In other groups, there were some guys that if we were by ourselves would be perfectly fine with this. But because we're in mixed groups, it's like, I don't like this. Like I'm shutting down from what it is we're doing and how we're doing it, because I shouldn't be talking about this
would, like
In
you
front of
asked,
another,
it made me
right?
think to ask my question when you asked, like, the guys in the room, raise your hand if you fit solely in this box. If you've got a room full of college guys, that's all that's in the room, like, I feel like there would be some guys more likely to raise their hand to try and assert that dominance and say, yeah, I fill that box, absolutely, but if you've got women in the room, I think they're gonna be more hesitant to admit that.
Yeah, acting out. There are all sorts of examples that I can give around what's the acting out look
Yeah.
like. What's the sense of, because we're asking some of this explicitly and implicitly, we're asking some of this, right? Again, whether they can name it or not, and some of the acting out and some of the protection and deflection is likely to happen more in spaces that are mixed. And this is both through experience of 25 plus years of the program of doing this, but this is empirical too. This has been studied in relation to this work, that there are elements of, it's not 100% in either direction, right? But the plus minus, right? The cost benefit sort of analysis of this has shaken out. So, okay.
I would also just throw out there, because you're asking people to be vulnerable, I have found it beneficial to somewhat soften my language in dividing groups to say, in this room, we're gonna talk about gender norms and stereotypes for men, and in this room, we're gonna talk about gender norms and stereotypes for women. And you can allow in space for a trans or non-binary student to say, that's what's gonna happen in this room. It might be beneficial to be in that room because you may have experienced a lot of the pressure from that world, or you might feel safer in one of the rooms. I let you choose and opt into whichever conversation you want. And just creating that space, I think, allows them to say, this is where I can be vulnerable, this is where I can engage in this is where I can't.
Yep, thank you. Okay, so, let's, part 5, can we do that? Thank you.
Yeah.